Stop faking for attention. This is my day. My sister Emma's voice cut through the elegant chatter of her engagement party, shrill and sharp enough to silence the string quartet in the corner of the Oakmont Country Club's grand ballroom. I looked up at her from my wheelchair, confused by the sudden venom in her eyes, and before I could process what was happening, her hands were on the armrests of my chair, and she shoved hard, sending me tumbling forward onto the polished marble floor. The impact knocked the breath from my lungs, my emerald green dress tearing at the shoulder as I tried to catch myself, pain shooting through my hip where the still healing bones protested the shock. Around me, 150 guests collectively gasped, the sound like air being sucked from the room. And for a moment, everything froze in that horrible tableau, me sprawling on the floor, Emma standing over me with her hands still outstretched, her face twisted into something ugly that didn't match her perfect updo and designer engagement dress. I had been using the wheelchair for 8 months now, ever since the accident that shattered my pelvis and traumatized my spine. 8 months of grueling physical therapy and pain that never quite disappeared, and the slow, agonizing work of learning whether I would ever walk normally again. Emma's fiancé Derek stood frozen near the gift table, his mouth open in shock, his champagne glass tilted and forgotten in his hand. Our parents rushed forward from where they had been greeting guests by the entrance, and I waited for the defense, for the outrage on my behalf. But my mother's first words as she reached us were, "Emma didn't mean it," already making excuses, already smoothing it over, already choosing which daughter mattered more. From my position on the cold floor, looking up at the crystal chandeliers and the horrified faces of family friends and Emma's sorority sisters and Derek's colleagues from the law firm, something crystallized in my mind with perfect, painful clarity. This was the breaking point. This moment, humiliating and public and undeniable, was the end of a pattern that had defined my entire life, 28 years of being second, of being the easy one, the quiet one, the one who didn't need as much attention or celebration or love. I didn't know it yet, but in pushing me out of my wheelchair, Emma had pushed me into finally standing up for myself. And nothing would ever be the same again. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. Looking back now, I can trace the pattern all the way to childhood, to the years when Emma and I were still young enough that I believed things might eventually balance out, that my turn for attention would come if I just waited patiently enough and didn't make too much noise about wanting it. Emma was always the golden child, 3 years older, and born with the kind of effortless beauty that made strangers stop my mother in grocery stores to comment on it, the kind of charisma that filled rooms and demanded spotlights, and seemed to justify the way our family's entire orbit shifted to accommodate her needs and wants and feelings. She was the beauty queen, literally, winning her first Little Miss Sunflower pageant at age 5, and continuing through a decade of crowns and sashes and trophies that lined an entire wall of shelves in our living room, each one representing a weekend when my parents drove 3 hours to some convention center while I stayed with my grandmother. I was the quiet one, the bookish one, the one who preferred drawing in sketchbooks to performing on stages. And I learned early that quiet children get overlooked in families where one child burns as bright as Emma did. I remember being 12 years old, standing in the mostly empty high school auditorium where my first real art show was being held, my watercolor paintings hung on portable walls with little printed cards bearing my name, and I kept watching the door, kept waiting for my parents to arrive, until the art teacher, Mrs. Patterson, gently told me they'd called to say they couldn't make it because Emma's regional pageant had run late. That same pageant, which Emma placed third in, was discussed at every dinner for the next month, the trophy given a special place on the mantel, my parents analyzing what had gone wrong with her evening gown walk and how she could improve for next time. In high school, I won the District Scholastic Art Award and a state-level recognition for my portfolio. Achievements that earned me a congratulations at dinner, and then an immediate shift to discussing Emma's homecoming crown, which she wore around the house for 2 weeks, and which was professionally photographed for a local magazine feature on her. When it came time for college, I wanted desperately to attend the Rhode Island School of Design, had been accepted with a partial scholarship, had dreams of studying illustration and design in a place where art wasn't just a hobby, but a calling. But my parents sat me down and explained that art school wasn't practical, that I should consider the state university where tuition was cheaper and I could get a degree in something stable. Emma, meanwhile, had a wedding fund started for her at 16, $5,000 tucked away and growing, because as my mother said, every girl dreams of her perfect wedding, and Emma had been planning hers since she was old enough to flip through bridal magazines. I went to state, majored in graphic design because it was the closest I could get to art while still being practical. And I worked 2 jobs to graduate without burdening my parents, who were by then helping Emma with her apartment deposit in the city where she'd moved to pursue a modeling career that never quite materialized. I was 28 now, and Emma was 31, and I had spent my entire life accommodating, bending, shrinking myself to fit whatever space was left after Emma's needs had been met, always hoping that eventually someone would notice I had worth too. The accident happened on a Tuesday in March, 8 months before Emma pushed me out of my wheelchair at her engagement party, and I remember every detail with the kind of clarity that trauma burns into your memory. I was driving home from a client meeting in the city, taking the highway route I'd driven 100 times before, and I had just merged into the right lane when a pickup truck came out of nowhere, swerving across 3 lanes of traffic and slamming into the driver's side of my sedan with enough force to spin my car completely around and send it careening into the concrete barrier. The drunk driver, as I would learn later from the police report, had a blood alcohol level 3 times the legal limit at 2 in the afternoon. The impact shattered my pelvis in 4 places, caused severe trauma to my lower spine, fractured 3 ribs, and left me unconscious for 6 hours before I woke up in the ICU with my parents standing over my bed looking terrified in a way I had never seen before. The orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Morrison, explained my injuries with careful precision. The pelvis would heal, but required surgical reconstruction with pins and plates. The spinal trauma hadn't severed anything critical, but the bruising and inflammation meant we wouldn't know the full extent of nerve damage for weeks. And I should prepare myself for a long recovery that would definitely include a wheelchair for 6 to 12 months, and possibly longer, depending on how my body responded to physical therapy. My parents were supportive in those first days, visiting daily, bringing me things from home, sitting with me through the worst of the pain when I couldn't sleep, and the medication made me nauseous, and the reality of what had happened kept crashing over me in waves of panic about whether I would walk again, whether I would work again, whether my entire life had just been derailed by someone else's terrible choice. But the support began to shift after about 2 weeks, started to feel more like obligation than genuine care, and I noticed my mother's visits growing shorter and her attention drifting to her phone, where she was constantly texting with Emma about something that seemed to require urgent consultation. 1 month after my accident, as I was being transferred to an outpatient rehab facility and learning to navigate my new wheelchair and trying to figure out how I was going to manage living alone in my apartment while recovering, Emma announced her engagement to Derek at Sunday family dinner, and just like that, the focus shifted entirely. My mother's first words after congratulating Emma were, "We have so much planning to do." And when I mentioned that I was scared about going home alone and managing my recovery, she patted my hand absently and said, "You'll figure it out, honey. At least it wasn't worse. You're lucky to be alive." And then immediately turned back to Emma to discuss potential wedding dates. I moved back to my hometown a week later, into a small ground-floor apartment that my father helped me find, because stairs were impossible now. And I watched as my injury became less a tragedy that had happened to their daughter and more an inconvenience that was taking attention away from Emma's big moment, her perfect engagement, her dream wedding that she had been planning since she was 16 years old. Emma's wedding planning consumed our family the way a wildfire consumes dry brush, fast and total, and leaving no room for anything else to exist in the space it claimed. Every family gathering became a wedding discussion. Every Sunday dinner transformed into a planning session where my mother pulled up Pinterest boards on her iPad and Emma spread fabric swatches across the table, and my father nodded along while reviewing venue contracts and catering quotes, and I sat at the end of the table in my wheelchair, invisible unless someone needed me to pass the salt or move aside so Emma could demonstrate the aisle width she wanted. My physical therapy progress was never asked about, not in any meaningful way, and on the rare occasions I tried to bring it up, the conversation would shift so quickly, I wondered if I had actually spoken out loud or just imagined doing so. I remember one Sunday in particular, about 4 months into my recovery, when I was excited because Dr. Sarah Chen, my physical therapist, had told me I was making remarkable progress and might be able to use a cane for short distances within another month, and I waited for a pause in the wedding discussion to mention it. And when that pause finally came, I said, Dr. Chen thinks I might be able to walk with a cane soon. And my mother looked up from the flower arrangements she was comparing and said, That's nice, honey. And then immediately turned to Emma and said, Emma, show Maya your dress options. Get her opinion. And just like that, my milestone was erased, and we were back to discussing whether Emma should go with the mermaid silhouette or the ball gown. The bridesmaid selection happened without me, which shouldn't have surprised me, but somehow still hurt with a sharp and specific pain that I felt in my chest for days afterward. And when I finally asked Emma why I wasn't included in the wedding party, she looked uncomfortable and said something about how the wheelchair would make the photos complicated, how the bridesmaid dresses required standing for long periods, how she didn't want me to feel pressured or uncomfortable, all of which were excuses that barely concealed the truth. I would ruin her perfect aesthetic. She did want me at the engagement party, though, with the caveat that I should try to stay in the background, which she said with a apologetic smile that didn't reach her eyes, as if asking me to make myself invisible at a family event was a reasonable request that I should simply accept because this was her time, her moment, her celebration. But I was working towards something they knew nothing about, something private and painful and so important that I hadn't told anyone in my family because I wanted it to be a surprise. Wanted one moment where they might see me and be proud and recognize that I was fighting my way back to myself with every ounce of strength I possessed. My therapy sessions with Dr. Chen were intense, 5 days a week for 90 minutes each session, and she pushed me harder than I thought I could bear, through exercises that left me crying with pain and frustration, through moments when I was certain my body would never work properly again, and she kept telling me, Maya, you're stronger than you think you are. You're going to walk again. You're going to stand on your own. And I held on to those words like a lifeline. The secret I carried, the one I protected fiercely, was that I could already stand with support, could take small steps holding on to parallel bars, and Dr. Chen and I had set a private goal to have me standing independently, even if just for a minute, by the time of Emma's engagement party. I wanted to surprise my family, wanted to see their faces when I stood up, wanted desperately for one moment of recognition that I was worth paying attention to, that my struggle and my progress and my strength mattered. Financially, I was drowning in ways my family never asked about, because they assumed I was on disability and that insurance covered everything. But the truth was, my savings were depleting rapidly because insurance only covered a portion of my therapy, and I was paying $200 per session out of pocket, which added up to $2,000 every 2 weeks, and I was watching my carefully built financial cushion disappear while trying to rebuild my body. But something unexpected happened during those months of isolation and pain and being overlooked. My freelance work picked up in ways I never anticipated. Because being confined to my apartment meant I was available online constantly, and I updated my portfolio website and started taking on remote projects. And slowly, client by client, I built a new base of work that didn't require me to be anywhere except at my computer, which was exactly where I already was. The week before Emma's engagement party, her demands escalated from merely inconsiderate to actively cruel in ways that made me question whether I should attend at all, whether subjecting myself to what I knew would be another celebration of Emma, while I sat invisibly in the corner, was worth the emotional cost I would pay for days afterward. She called me on Monday morning and asked, in that sweet voice she used when she wanted something, if I could wear something that doesn't draw attention to the wheelchair. And when I asked what that meant, she said something simple and dark, something that would blend in, because she wanted the focus to be on the celebration and not on the situation, which was apparently what my disability had become in her mind. A situation rather than a reality I lived with every moment of every day. She also suggested I arrive early and position myself in a corner near the gift table, somewhere out of the main flow of traffic, and the way she phrased it made it sound like she was doing me a favor, protecting me from the exhaustion of socializing, when what she really meant was that she wanted me hidden. I spent 2 days wrestling with whether to go, sitting in my apartment and staring at the elegant invitation with its gold lettering and thinking about all the ways this evening would hurt. All the ways I would be overlooked and dismissed and made to feel like an inconvenience at my own sister's celebration, and I had almost decided to make up an excuse, to claim I was sick or that my pain was too severe, when Derek called me on Wednesday evening. Derek had always been kind to me in a distant sort of way, polite and friendly, but never really engaging beyond surface pleasantries. But this phone call was different, his voice quiet and serious when he said, "Maya, I need to apologize for Emma's behavior. The things she's been saying to you aren't okay." I was so surprised I didn't know what to say at first, and he continued, "I've been noticing how the family treats you, and I've been telling myself it's not my place to interfere, but after what Emma said to you about staying in the corner, I can't stay quiet anymore. You deserve better than this." His words broke something open in my chest, the validation from someone who saw what was happening, and I found myself crying on the phone while he told me that he hoped I would come to the party, that I had every right to be there, that I was part of this family even if they didn't always act like it. After we hung up, I sat with his words and thought about Dr. Chen, who had been telling me for months that I deserved to take up space, that my presence mattered, that I should be proud of how hard I had worked to get stronger, and I made a decision. I would go to this party, and I would go looking beautiful, and I would hold my head high even if no one else noticed. I went shopping the next day and found a dress in deep emerald green that made my skin glow and my eyes bright. And I bought it even though it cost more than I should have spent, because I needed to feel beautiful, needed armor for what I knew was coming. The day of the party arrived on a Saturday in November, cold and clear, and I spent the morning practicing transfers from my wheelchair, building the arm strength I would need for the evening, and doing the standing exercises Dr. Chen had taught me, holding onto my kitchen counter and bearing weight on my healing legs for longer and longer intervals, pushing through the pain because I was working towards something they didn't know about, something I had kept secret because I wanted one moment, just one, where they might look at me with pride. I arrived at the country club at exactly the time Emma had requested, early enough to be positioned before the main guests arrived, and immediately my mother intercepted me and guided me to a corner area near the elaborately decorated gift table, saying, "You'll be comfortable here, won't you, honey?" in a tone that wasn't really asking. My father was busy greeting early arrivals, my mother fluttered around Emma like she was a bride already, and I sat in my designated corner watching the room fill with 150 guests, all dressed beautifully, all here to celebrate my sister's happiness while I occupied my assigned invisible space. Multiple guests stopped by to ask about my recovery, genuinely kind people who remembered me from before the accident, and I would begin to answer, to tell them about my progress or my therapy, and almost every time Emma would materialize beside us with her pageant smile and redirect the conversation, saying things like, "Let's not make this about Maya's accident. Tonight is supposed to be celebratory," or "Maya's doing great, but let me tell you about our honeymoon plans." I felt the frustration mounting with each interruption, felt the tears threatening, and I kept fighting them back because I refused to cry, refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing how much this hurt. The toasts began after dinner, and my father stood with his champagne glass and delivered a speech that was 90% about Emma, about her beauty and grace, and how proud he was of the woman she had become, with one brief mention of both our daughters that felt like an afterthought, a obligatory inclusion that meant nothing. My mother's speech was even worse, entirely focused on Emma's perfection, on her match with Derek, on how she had always known Emma would find someone worthy of her, and there was no mention of me at all, and I sat in my corner feeling like I was disappearing, becoming less real with every word that erased me from this family's story. Emma moved toward the gift table where I sat positioned like a piece of decorative furniture, her smile fixed and bright for the guests, but her eyes sharp with irritation, and I knew before she even spoke that something was about to happen, could feel it in the tension of her shoulders and the way her hands were clenched at her sides beneath the champagne flute she carried like a prop. A guest named Patricia Chen, no relation to my physical therapist, had asked me about my work because she recognized my name from a design blog she followed, and I had been explaining a recent project, a rebranding package for a tech startup that was launching in 3 months, and I was surprised by how good it felt to talk about my work, to have someone genuinely interested in what I did, rather than viewing me as the tragic accident victim in the corner. A small crowd had gathered, maybe 5 or 6 people, leaning in to look at the mock-ups I pulled up on my phone, asking questions about my design process and my client base. And for just a few minutes, I forgot about being invisible, forgot about sitting in my assigned corner, forgot about the pain in my hip and the exhaustion in my arms, and the years of being overlooked, because these strangers were seeing me as a professional, as someone with skills and accomplishments, as someone worth listening to. Emma noticed the attention shifting toward me, the way a predator notices movement in its peripheral vision, swift and immediate and triggering something instinctive, and she approached with that fake smile she had perfected in years of pageants, the one that looked warm in photographs but never reached her eyes. "Maya, can you move?" she asked, her voice light but with an edge underneath like a knife wrapped in silk. "You're blocking the gift display." I turned to look at her, confused because I was positioned exactly where she had told me to be, in the spot she had assigned me hours ago. "I'm just talking with," I started, but she cut me off. "This is my engagement party," she said, her voice rising slightly, the smile slipping just a fraction. "Everything isn't about you." The words hit me like a slap, shocking in their cruelty, and I felt my face flush hot with embarrassment and hurt. "I know that, Emma. I was just—" I tried again, but she wasn't listening, was already building towards something I couldn't stop. "Ever since the accident, you act like you're the only one with problems," she said, loud enough now that nearby conversations were stopping, heads turning toward us. The room was going quiet in that horrible way that meant everyone was listening, everyone was watching, and I wanted to disappear, wanted to sink through the floor. "That's not fair," I said quietly, trying to de-escalate, trying to make this stop before it became a scene. "I never—" But Emma was on a roll now, years of resentment I hadn't even known she felt pouring out in front of 150 witnesses. "You're not even that hurt anymore," she said, her voice sharp and dismissive. "Dr. Morrison told Mom you're healing fine." Dr. Morrison was the emergency room doctor who had seen me immediately after the accident, who had no idea about my ongoing recovery, and the fact that my mother had been discussing my medical situation with Emma while barely asking me about it felt like another betrayal stacked on top of all the others. "I am healing, but it's still—" I tried to explain, but Emma was beyond hearing me now, was caught up in whatever narrative she had constructed, where I was the villain in her story. "Oh, please," she said, sneering now, the beautiful mask slipping away to reveal something ugly underneath. "Stop faking for attention." And then she pushed the wheelchair, her hands on the armrests, shoving hard and sudden, and I tumbled forward onto the marble floor, the impact jarring through my healing bones, my emerald dress tearing at the shoulder, and the room erupted in gasps and shocked silence, and I lay there on the cold floor, understanding with perfect clarity that nothing would ever be the same again. The marble floor was cold and hard beneath me, the impact reverberating through my healing hip and sending sharp pain radiating up my spine in a way that made my vision blur at the edges, and for a moment I couldn't breathe, couldn't process what had just happened, could only lie there in my torn emerald dress with the entire country club frozen in shocked silence around me. The crowd stood motionless like someone had pressed pause on reality, 150 people holding their breath, and then Derek moved, rushed forward with his face twisted in horror and disbelief, and he shouted, "Emma! What the hell?" with more force than I had ever heard from his normally gentle voice. Emma stood there with her hand over her mouth in a gesture that might have looked like remorse to anyone who didn't know her, but I could see her eyes, could see that they weren't apologetic at all but defiant, almost triumphant, like she had finally put me in my place. My mother hurried over in her champagne-colored dress, her heels clicking rapidly on the marble, but her first words weren't to ask if I was hurt, weren't to check on her daughter who had just been pushed from a wheelchair, but rather, "Emma didn't mean it. She's just stressed about the wedding." Already making excuses, already protecting the golden child. My father knelt beside me, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he helped me sit up, and he asked, "Are you hurt? Can you move?" With genuine concern in his voice, but even in my shock and pain, I noticed that he looked at Emma with worry, not anger, as if she was the one who needed protection in this moment. Something crystallized in my mind as I sat there on that cold floor, a perfect clarity cutting through the pain and embarrassment, and I understood with sudden sharp focus that this was the pattern I had been living my entire life. Emma acting out, and everyone rushing to excuse her, to smooth things over, to protect her from the consequences of her cruelty, while I was expected to understand, to forgive, to make myself smaller so she could remain large. Emma looked down at me and said, her voice sharp and defensive, "She's fine. She's always fine. This is exactly the attention-seeking I meant." And the audacity of it. The cruel rewriting of reality, where I had somehow orchestrated being pushed from my wheelchair, made something shift inside me, something that had been bending for 28 years, finally refusing to bend anymore. Derek turned on Emma with fury I didn't know he possessed, and said, "Emma, stop. Just stop talking." But Emma was already turning away, already dismissing what she had done. My mother reached for me and said in her let's be reasonable voice, "Let's get you up and not make a scene." And I looked at her with new eyes, with clarity that hurt worse than my hip, and I said quietly but firmly, "Not make a scene?" She pushed me out of my wheelchair and watched her face flush as she realized people were listening, were recording on their phones, were bearing witness. Rachel, my best friend from college who I hadn't seen in months because I'd been too ashamed to let her visit while I was in recovery, pushed through the crowd with tears streaming down her face, and she knelt beside me and said, "I saw everything. Everyone saw." And the way she said it, fierce and protective, made me realize I wasn't alone, that there were people who saw the truth even if my family refused to. The guests were murmuring now, shocked conversations rippling through the room, and I could hear fragments of their words. "Did she just?" And "I can't believe." And "That poor girl." And I made a decision in that moment lying on the marble floor, made a choice that would change everything, because I was done being the poor girl, done being the quiet one, done disappearing so Emma could shine. I looked up at Rachel from the cold marble floor and said, my voice shaking but determined, "Help me to my feet, and she stared at me with confusion written across her face, glancing between me and the wheelchair that lay on its side a few feet away. Your feet? Maya, should we get your chair? She asked, kneeling beside me with her hands hovering uncertainly, and I shook my head with sudden clarity about what I needed to do, what this moment required of me. No. Help me stand, I said, and I saw the understanding dawn in her eyes, even as worry creased her forehead, because she knew what I was asking, knew that Dr. Chen had been preparing me for standing without support soon, but that I wasn't quite ready yet, that the timeline we had discussed was still weeks away. But I had made my decision lying on that floor, had chosen in that moment of perfect clarity that I was done being pushed down, done being silenced, done being small, and if I was going to stand up for myself, then I was going to do it literally, physically, with every ounce of strength I had built through 3 months of excruciating therapy. Rachel moved to one side and Derek appeared on the other without being asked, both of them understanding instinctively what I needed. Their hands gentle but firm on my arms as I began to rise, and I put weight on my legs for the first time in front of my family, feeling the familiar burn in my hip and the trembling weakness in my knees, but pushing through it, rising slowly inch by inch while the crowd watched in stunned silence. The pain was immediate and intense, shooting up from my pelvis through my spine in waves that made my vision blur, but I had learned to work through pain, had spent 5 days a week crying through exercises that pushed my body beyond what seemed possible, and this pain was purposeful, was mine to claim. The crowd gasped again, but the sound was different now. Not horror, but shock, mixed with something else. Maybe admiration, maybe disbelief. And I rose fully to standing with Rachel and Derek barely touching my arms, their support more symbolic than physical, and I locked my knees and felt my feet solid on the marble floor. Emma's voice cut through the silence, sharp with accusation. What are you doing? You can't walk. And I turned my head to look at her, standing there in her perfect engagement party dress, with her perfect life crumbling around her, and I said with a voice that was steady, despite the trembling in my legs, I've been working toward this for 3 months. I was standing fully now, my weight balanced on both feet, and though Rachel and Derek's hands remained near my arms, they were barely touching me, ready to catch me if I fell, but letting me hold myself up. And I felt powerful in a way I hadn't felt since before the accident, maybe in a way I had never felt in my entire life. My mother's voice rose in panic. Maya, sit down. You'll hurt yourself. But I shook my head and said firmly, No, I'm done sitting down. I'm done being quiet. And I turned to face Emma directly, maintaining eye contact as I said, I have tried my entire life to be happy for you, to support you, to celebrate your achievements, and make myself small so you could shine brighter. Emma's face was pale now, her earlier defiance cracking, and she said with desperation creeping into her voice, This is manipulation. You could walk this whole time? And the accusation was so absurd, so perfectly emblematic of how she saw the world with herself always at the center, that I almost laughed. No, I said, my voice growing stronger even as my legs grew weaker. I've been in excruciating pain learning to walk again. Physical therapy 5 days a week. Crying through exercises that pushed my body past what I thought was possible. And not once, did any of you ask how it was going, ask what I was working toward, ask if you could come to a session or help me practice or celebrate the small victories. My father stepped forward and said defensively, That's not fair, we've been supportive. And I turned to him with tears streaming down my face and said, my voice breaking, You visited me twice in 8 months, Dad. Twice. My legs were trembling now from the effort of standing and my hip burned with that deep ache that signaled I was pushing far past what Dr. Chen had cleared me for. But I wasn't finished. Couldn't be finished until I said what needed to be said. So I turned my attention to my parents and said with a clarity that cut through the shocked silence of the country club, Every family dinner for the past 8 months was wedding planning, centerpieces and seating charts, and whether to have salmon or chicken. And every single time I tried to mention my progress in therapy, tried to share that I'd stood for 10 seconds, or walked 3 steps, or moved without crying, I was told not to make everything about me. My mother's face flushed defensive red, and she said with that tight voice she used when she felt attacked, "Emma's getting married, Maya. It's an important time for our family." And I laughed, a short, bitter sound that surprised even me. "And my learning to walk again wasn't important?" I asked, looking directly at her. And she opened her mouth, but no words came out, because what could she say? How could she defend the indefensible? I turned to Emma, who stood frozen in her perfect champagne-colored dress, and said with my voice growing stronger despite my weakening legs, "You told me I couldn't be in your wedding party because my wheelchair would ruin your pictures." And Emma shook her head rapidly, saying, "I didn't say that exactly." But Rachel cut her off. My beautiful, fierce friend who had driven 3 hours to be here tonight, saying loudly, "Yes, you did. I was there when you said it. I was on speakerphone when you told Maya that wheelchairs didn't fit your aesthetic." The bridesmaids standing near Emma, 4 perfectly coordinated women in matching dresses, shifted uncomfortably, and I saw 2 of them nod slightly, confirming Rachel's words, unable to deny what they had witnessed. "You've treated my disability like an inconvenience to your life," I said to Emma, and Derek turned to her with his face pale and stricken, asking, "Is this true? All of this?" And Emma's eyes darted around the room looking for support, for someone to rescue her the way our family always had, and she said desperately, "You don't understand. She's always been jealous of me, always tried to compete for attention." I laughed again, bitter and genuine, and said, "Jealous? Of being cruel to your sister? Of pushing someone in a wheelchair because they dared to have a conversation?" And I was standing stronger now, the adrenaline carrying me through the pain, and Rachel was barely supporting me anymore, just standing close in case I needed her. A family friend, Mrs. Peterson, who had known us since we were children, spoke up from the crowd saying quietly but firmly, "Emma, I think you owe Maya an apology." And Emma whirled on her with wild eyes and said, "For what? She's standing. She was clearly faking how bad it was." And that was when Dr. Sarah Chen pushed through the crowd in her elegant navy dress, and I had forgotten she was here, had forgotten that Emma invited half the town, including my physical therapist. And Dr. Chen said in her calm professional voice that somehow carried authority through the entire room, "I'm Maya's physical therapist, and I need everyone here to understand that Maya has worked harder than any patient I've ever seen in 15 years of practice. Standing unsupported for more than 30 seconds is agony for her right now. What you're witnessing is extraordinary courage and strength, not fakery." My legs were starting to shake with genuine fatigue now, and I could feel the familiar burn in my hip intensifying. The kind of deep ache that Dr. Chen had warned me meant I was pushing too far. So when Rachel brought my wheelchair over, I sank into it gratefully. But this time it felt different, felt like I was choosing to sit rather than being confined there. And that distinction meant everything. I took a breath to steady myself and said to the crowd still gathered around in shocked silence, "I didn't come here to cause a scene. I came to support my sister. But I'm done being invisible." My mother stepped forward with her hands fluttering nervously and said in that high, strained voice, "You're being dramatic, Maya. No one said you were invisible." And I felt that old familiar urge to back down, to apologize, to make myself smaller so everyone else could be comfortable. But instead, I reached into the small bag attached to my wheelchair and pulled out my phone with hands that were shaking from exertion and adrenaline. "3 months ago, I was contacted by someone in this room," I said, pulling up my email and holding the phone so others could see the screen. "Allison Chang, from Chang Media Group." There was a moment of confused silence as people looked around, and then an elegant woman in her 50s stepped forward from near the back of the crowd, wearing a perfectly tailored black dress and pearls, and she said with a warm smile directed at me, "It's true. I found Maya's design portfolio online while searching for a new brand identity for my company. Her rebrand concepts were brilliant, innovative, and emotionally resonant in ways I hadn't seen from any of the major agencies I'd consulted. Emma's voice cut through sharp with confusion and irritation. "What does this have to do with anything?" And Allison turned to her with an expression that was perfectly polite, but somehow dismissive, and said, "The project launched last week. It's already increased our client engagement by 34%, and we're seeing remarkable response from our target demographic. I paid Maya $180,000 for the work." The gasps from the crowd were audible and immediate, and I watched my mother's face go pale as she said, "What? Maya, why didn't you tell us?" And I looked at her directly and said with a calmness I didn't entirely feel, "I tried. At Sunday dinner 6 weeks ago, I said I had exciting work news to share. You changed the subject to Emma's honeymoon plans before I could finish the sentence." My father was staring at me like he'd never seen me before, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to find words, and I could see him struggling to remember that dinner, to reconcile what I was saying with his memory of how the conversation had gone. "And Allison isn't my only client," I said, looking around at the faces of people I'd known my whole life. People who had watched me grow up in Emma's shadow and had probably never given me a second thought. I continued speaking because I had started, and there was no going back now, no retreating into the safe invisibility I had lived in for so long, and I said to the crowd still watching with rapt attention, "The accident forced me to go fully remote with my work, and it was terrifying at first, because I thought I'd lose everything, lose all the clients I'd spent years building relationships with, lose my reputation and my income, and any chance at independence." I pulled up my portfolio on my phone and began passing it to the guests nearest me, watching as they scrolled through the images of sleek corporate identities and vibrant startup branding and advertising campaigns that had run in major markets. 4 corporate rebrands, 7 startup identity packages, 3 major ad campaigns for national brands, I said, and Rachel, who knew every detail of my success because she was the one person who had actually asked about my life during these 8 months, said with unmistakable pride in her voice, "Tell them the total, Maya." I hesitated because it felt like boasting, and I had spent my entire life making myself smaller. But then I looked at Emma's face still flushed with anger, and my mother's expression of shocked confusion, and I thought, why shouldn't I tell them? Why shouldn't they know what I accomplished while they assumed I was helpless? "In 8 months, I've earned $420,000, I said, and Emma's face went pale as she said in a choked voice, "That's not possible." Derek took my phone from a guest who had been examining it and studied the portfolio with genuine interest before looking at Emma and saying quietly, "Emma, look at the work. It's incredible." But Emma wouldn't look, couldn't look, and my father reached for the phone with trembling hands and scrolled through the images slowly before saying in a voice I'd never heard from him before, "This is, Maya, this is really yours?" I nodded and said, "Every pixel. Designed from my apartment, between therapy sessions, at 2 in the morning when the pain wouldn't let me sleep, during the hours when I was supposed to be depressed and helpless and broken. While you all assumed I had nothing, I built everything." Allison spoke up again from her position near the front of the crowd and said with professional authority, "Maya's becoming one of the most sought-after designers in our industry. I've referred her to 3 colleagues in the past month alone, and they've all hired her. Her waiting list is currently 3 months long." My mother had tears forming in her eyes now, and she said in a small voice, "Why didn't you tell us?" And I looked at her directly and said with a calmness that came from finally speaking truth I'd held back for too long, "I shouldn't have to earn $1 billion to be worth your attention, Mom. I shouldn't have to prove my worth with a bank statement. But since we're here, and since apparently my success is the only thing that makes you listen, I'm also moving." Emma's head snapped up and she said, "Moving where?" And I said clearly so everyone in the room could hear, "Seattle. I've been offered a creative director position at a design firm there, with a $250,000 salary plus equity. I accepted the offer yesterday. Emma's face crumpled suddenly, and tears started streaming down her cheeks as she said in a choked voice, "You're leaving? You're moving across the country?" And I looked at her crying there in her perfect engagement party dress surrounded by the wreckage of what was supposed to be her perfect day, and I felt something shift inside me, not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of sad clarity, and I said simply, "Yes." Emma's voice rose with desperate confusion as she said, "But you're my sister. You're supposed to be here." And I felt Rachel's hand squeeze my shoulder in support as I said with a voice that was softer than before, but still firm with conviction, "I've been here, Emma. You just never looked." Derek had been standing slightly apart watching his fiancée with an expression I couldn't quite read, and then he moved forward and took Emma's arm gently but purposefully and said in a voice that was quiet but carried clearly through the silent room, "Emma, we need to talk. Now." Emma turned to him with mascara running down her face and said, "Derek, not now. Please, not now." But Derek shook his head and said with a finality that made several guests shift uncomfortably, "Yes, now. What I just saw, what you just did, that's not the person I thought I was marrying." Emma's eyes went wide with panic as she said, "What are you talking about? Derek, she's fine, she's standing right there." And Derek said with a hardness in his voice I'd never heard before, "You pushed your disabled sister out of her wheelchair at our engagement party in front of 150 people." Emma's voice turned shrill as she gestured at me sitting in my wheelchair and said, "She's not even really disabled. She was standing. She's been able to walk this whole time and she let everyone think she was helpless." And Derek closed his eyes briefly, like he was gathering patience before saying, "She's in recovery, Emma. There's a difference, and you know it." Then Derek turned to address the crowd of guests who were all still standing there frozen in various states of shock and discomfort, and he said with genuine remorse in his voice, "I'm sorry, everyone, but this party is over. Thank you for coming." Emma grabbed his arm and said with rising panic, "What? Derek, no, we can't just end the party." But Derek gently removed her hand from his arm and said quietly but clearly enough that I could hear every word, "I need time to think about whether this wedding should happen at all." The sound Emma made was somewhere between a gasp and a sob as she said, "You can't be serious, you can't be saying this." And Derek looked at her with something like sorrow in his eyes, and then turned to me and said, "I'm so sorry, Maya. I should have spoken up before. I've seen how they treat you. I've watched it happen at family dinners and holiday gatherings. And I convinced myself it wasn't my place to say anything because I was marrying into the family and I didn't want to cause problems." I felt my throat tighten with unexpected emotion as I said, "Thank you for saying it now. That means more than you know." My parents had been standing together near the gift table looking shell-shocked, and my father suddenly stepped forward with his hands raised in a placating gesture and said, "Derek, let's not be hasty here. Emma's under a tremendous amount of stress with the wedding planning and she's not thinking clearly." But Derek turned to him with an expression of disappointment and said something that made my father stop mid-sentence. "Stress doesn't make you cruel, sir. Character makes you kind under stress. And what I saw tonight tells me something about character that I can't ignore." The guests began leaving in small groups and clusters, some of them moving quickly with uncomfortable expressions, like they wanted to escape the scene of what had just happened. But others lingered near me and approached with business cards extended and tentative smiles, as they said things like, "If you're taking clients before you move to Seattle, I'd love to discuss a project." And, "My company is looking for a rebrand, and your work is exactly what we need." I took each card with hands that were steadier than I expected and responded graciously and professionally the way I'd learned to do in years of freelancing, giving out my contact information and promising to follow up via email within the week, and through it all, Rachel never left my side, standing slightly behind my wheelchair with one hand resting protectively on my shoulder and a fierce pride radiating from her that I could feel without looking. Emma had disappeared into one of the back rooms with my mother following close behind, and even from across the country club's main ballroom, I could hear Emma's voice rising in pitch and anger as she said words I couldn't quite make out, except for one phrase that came through crystal clear. "This is all her fault. She ruined everything." I felt something twist in my chest at those words. Not pain exactly, but a kind of sad recognition that even now, even after everything that had just happened, Emma couldn't see what she'd done. My father approached slowly after most of the guests had filtered out, and he sat down heavily in one of the ornate chairs that had been arranged around the room for the party, positioning himself beside my wheelchair and looking at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Something raw and unguarded, and he said quietly, "I didn't realize, Maya. I didn't realize how we'd been treating you." I looked at him directly and said with a calmness that surprised me, "Yes, you did, Dad. You just didn't think it mattered enough to stop it." And he flinched like I'd struck him before saying, "That's harsh." And I responded, "It's true. Emma's been the priority our entire lives." My father was quiet for a long moment before he said in a voice that sounded like he was trying to justify something to himself as much as to me, "She needed more attention, Maya. She was always more sensitive, more fragile emotionally." And I felt anger flare hot in my chest as I said, "And I needed attention too, Dad. I was just quieter about it, and that didn't make my needs less real." I watched as my father's face crumpled and tears started sliding down his cheeks, and he said in a broken voice, "I failed you." And I didn't contradict him because it was true, but I also said, "Yes, but you can do better, starting now. If you want to be part of my life going forward, things have to change." He looked up at me with desperate hope in his eyes and asked, "What do you need?" And I said simply, "I need you to see me, Dad. Actually see me. Not as Emma's sister, or the easy one who never complains, but as myself." 3 months later, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of my new apartment in Seattle, looking out at the city skyline with the Space Needle rising in the distance and the morning sun catching on Elliott Bay, and I was holding my cane in one hand, but not leaning on it because I'd just walked from my bedroom to the living room without any support at all. My laptop was propped open on the coffee table behind me, showing Dr. Chen's face on a video call, and she was smiling with the kind of professional pride that had become genuine friendship over the months of grueling therapy, as she said, "You're ahead of schedule on your recovery, Maya. I have to say I'm impressed, but not surprised given how hard you've worked." I turned back to the screen and sat down carefully on the couch and said, "I'm walking a mile every morning now along the waterfront path. It still hurts, especially in the cold, but it's manageable and getting easier every week." My home office setup occupied one corner of the open concept living space with a standing desk and an ergonomic chair and two large monitors displaying the design project I'd been working on that morning. And on the shelf above my desk sat 3 industry awards I'd won in the past 2 months, including one that had been shipped to me just last week. There was also a copy of Design Quarterly magazine with a feature article about emerging creative directors and my photo on page 43, an interview I'd done about building a business during recovery that had led to 7 new client inquiries. My phone rang with my father's name appearing on the screen, and I answered it with less hesitation than I would have felt 3 months ago, and his voice came through warm but careful as he asked, "How are you doing, sweetheart? How's the leg feeling this week?" And I noticed that he'd asked about me first, about my actual well-being, instead of launching into family news or Emma's latest crisis. We talked for 20 minutes about my work and my apartment and the physical therapy practice I'd found in Seattle, and he told me he'd be visiting in 2 weeks, just him, to see my new life and spend time together. And he said, "Your mother wants to come too, but I told her it should just be me first. I think we need to rebuild things one step at a time." It was progress, slow but real. The kind of change that only happens when someone genuinely commits to doing better. Rachel had texted me that morning to confirm she was visiting next month and bringing her boyfriend to meet me finally. and she'd added about 15 excited emojis and a comment about how she couldn't wait to see my new place and explore Seattle together. I'd also received a text from Derek 2 weeks earlier that simply said, "Engagement officially ended. Papers signed. Thank you for showing me the truth about who she was before I made the biggest mistake of my life." And I'd responded with genuine wishes for his happiness, because he'd done the right thing in the end, even though it had cost him. Emma had tried to contact me 17 times since I'd moved to Seattle, and I'd scrolled through the messages that morning while drinking my coffee, watching the progression from anger in the first texts that called me selfish and accused me of ruining her life, to defensiveness in the middle messages that tried to justify what had happened at the engagement party, to something that looked almost like remorse in the most recent ones, where she admitted she'd been cruel and said she was trying to understand why. I hadn't blocked her number, but I hadn't responded either because I wasn't ready yet, and I didn't know if I ever would be, and I'd learned that being okay with that uncertainty was part of my healing. Allison had called yesterday with another major commission, a global corporation that had specifically requested my work after seeing the Chang Media rebrand, and she'd said with satisfaction in her voice, "You're being requested by name now, Maya. That's when you know you've really made it in this industry." I sat at my desk in the late afternoon light, working on a new design for a women's advocacy nonprofit that had reached out to me about a pro bono project, something I'd committed to doing regularly now that my financial situation was secure enough to give back. And as I adjusted the color palette and refined the typography, I found myself thinking about how the engagement party had been 6 months ago now, half a year since that moment when I'd been on the marble floor of the country club, looking up at my sister's face and feeling everything crystallize inside me with a clarity I'd never experienced before. That moment had changed everything, because lying there, I'd realized I'd been waiting for my family's approval my entire life, waiting to be seen and valued and recognized. And the accident and the brutal months of recovery had taught me something fundamental that I should have learned years earlier, which was that I didn't need their validation to have worth. My worth wasn't determined by whether my parents showed up to my art show, or remembered to ask about my work, or treated my achievements as equal to Emma's. And standing at that party hadn't just been a physical act of bearing weight on legs that were still healing. It had been standing up for myself finally after 28 years of making myself smaller to accommodate everyone else's needs. My phone buzzed on the desk beside my laptop, and I glanced at it to see Emma's name on the screen with a message preview, her 18th attempt to reach me since I'd moved to Seattle, and I picked up the phone and read the full text that said, "Maya, please talk to me. I'm in therapy twice a week now, and I'm trying to understand what I did and why I did it. Derek left me, and Mom's barely speaking to me because she blames me for driving you away. And I know I lost everything, but you were right about all of it. I was cruel and selfish, and I treated you like you didn't matter." I read the message twice and felt something unexpected move through my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of compassion mixed with absolute clarity about what I needed, and I typed back carefully, "I'm glad you're in therapy, Emma. I genuinely hope you find peace and learn to be kinder to yourself and other people. But I need you to understand something important. Your apology doesn't obligate my forgiveness, and it doesn't mean things go back to how they were." I continued typing. "I'm building a life now that doesn't have room for people who make me feel small or invisible. A life where I'm valued for who I actually am, and maybe someday that changes and we find a way to have a relationship, but not today, and maybe not ever, and I need you to be okay with that." I sent the message and then turned off my phone completely and set it face down on the desk, and I looked back at the design on my screen, which was coming together beautifully, bold and feminine and strong, exactly what the organization had asked for. My calendar notification popped up reminding me about next week's speaking engagement at a major design conference in Portland. My first keynote address with a topic I'd chosen myself called "Finding Your Voice When the World Won't Listen," and I felt nervous excitement about standing on that stage and sharing my story with hundreds of designers and creatives who might need to hear that success can come from the darkest moments if you're willing to do the work. I stood from my desk without reaching for my cane and walked to the kitchen with only the slightest hitch in my gait, the pain manageable now and getting better every week. And I made tea in the blue ceramic mug Rachel had given me as a housewarming gift while looking out at the Seattle skyline with the late afternoon sun turning the glass buildings gold. I remembered the girl I'd been 6 months ago, the one who couldn't imagine standing up to her family or believing her needs were as important as Emma's. And I realized that girl was gone completely, transformed by pain and effort and the decision to finally value herself. In her place stood a woman who knew her worth, who'd built a thriving business from a hospital bed and a wheelchair, who'd learned to walk again through sheer determination, who'd stood up literally and figuratively when her sister tried to push her down. The doorbell rang and I walked to answer it, finding my neighbor Claire from down the hall, the graphic novelist I'd befriended at the building's community gathering last month, and she smiled and said, "Coffee walk in 30 minutes? I need to get out of my apartment before I go stir-crazy with revisions." And I said, "Absolutely. I'll be ready. Just let me save my work." I closed my laptop and caught my reflection in the window as I passed, seeing myself standing tall and smiling with genuine happiness. And I thought about how the life I'd built was completely my own now, chosen and created by me. And no one could take it away, because it wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval or recognition. My sister had pushed me out of my wheelchair thinking she was putting me in my place and showing everyone that I was faking or exaggerating or seeking attention. But instead, she'd pushed me into becoming who I was always meant to be, someone who knew her value and refused to accept less than she deserved. And standing here in my Seattle apartment with work I loved and friends I'd chosen and a future I was building on my own terms, I'd never been more grateful to be standing on my own.